So switch your gears. One size does not fit all. And this is one of my real bugbears here. And how many times, we know, all of us in the room know, that multiple patient journeys exist side by side. No one patient journey is like somebody else's in essence. But how many times have we done lots and lots of work, then produced a single archetype of a patient journey, presented it back to the organisation, and based all of our future work on that patient journey? I mean, put your hands up if you've been involved in that process, because I know that I've done precisely that on more than one occasion. We need to move beyond that, and we need to think about tools and methods that can help us to make sense of the multiple patient journeys and identify journeys where there's a real difference, and that journey leads to different needs for patients. And I think we've got some tools that can help us to do that a little bit. So in the next slide, I'm going to talk about a few of those techniques that we might think about using. The first is patient-driven, to actually think about the different types of patients we have suffering from a given condition and how that might affect both their journey and subsequently the needs that they have. One of the companies that we're working with in oncology, Hive, actually did some work for GSK in the acne setting, and they came up with a really interesting model that was patient-driven. It seems simple, and it's based on there being essentially three archetypes of patients who have very different journeys based on who they are. The teenager with acne, patients who have adult onset acne, and actually adult patients who've had acne since they were a teenager and continue to suffer from it. And that third group is really interesting because psychologically they have a whole load of feelings of being let down by their physicians and by the treatments they've previously tried that are very different to some of those other groups. So it's a really interesting dynamic that's patient-led that has some very different implications. Secondly, I'll talk a little bit about institution. Andrew talked about flying across America to go to MD Anderson. In melanoma, the field that I'm working in at the moment, this is really important, this idea that patients can get a very different experience just based on where they go. If you have advanced melanoma and you are treated at the Royal Marsden, which is one of the world's leading centres for melanoma, it's really likely your experience will be quite different than if you're treated at a district general by a physician with relatively limited familiarity with melanoma, who's unlikely to have access to specialist nurses and certainly won't be able to put you into the kind of advanced clinical trials that are the stock in trade of a hospital like the Royal Marsden. So the journey, even for the same patient with the same condition, can be very different just thinking about where you go. And that applies on a more macro level if we're thinking across Europe to health systems, if we're thinking about globally health system-related factors. I think thinking about that kind of level of patient orientation is really important. And finally, psychographic, behavioural differences accounting for difference in the patient journey. I think we're aware of, and in this room for sure, we'll be very aware of the challenge of different patients based on their beliefs about treatment, their beliefs about medicines, or their level of engagement with their condition. They can have a very different journey dependent on those factors. And I think one thing to remember here is that healthcare professionals are different too. And there are different healthcare professionals with different attitudes. And so if we pass that out, at the opposite ends of the spectrum, the journey and the experience of a very engaged, very well-informed patient, Andrew, if you like, who visits a clinician who then has an attitude which is one of involving the patients in a shared decision-making model, that journey can look very different to a less informed, less engaged patient who visits a clinician who essentially doesn't believe in the role of patients in their decision-making and doesn't really believe in consultation. They look very different. So just to build on this a little bit, because I think this psychographic area is the area that's the ripest for exploration and the ripest for advances at the moment. I think the first thing I would say in this respect, if this will build, that the science, the behavioural science, is really starting to catch up with the aspiration of being able to identify different groups. And with the Beliefs About Medicines questionnaire and the validation that's taken place of that in the last few years, the emergence of the patient activation measures scale as a validated tool, and there are numerous other tools. I'm sure there are experts in the room who know a lot more about this than me. We've actually got some prospective tools that can tell us that based on people's beliefs about treatment, their levels of activation or involvement, engagement in their disease, they're likely to have a different kind of medicines taking experience. Secondly, and importantly, with the changes in the environment that we talked about, in terms of that greater level of data, that greater level of patient visibility in the system, we're now able to start to access patients and get information, engage with patients who are more likely to be typical of the standard patient in terms of their level of engagement. Traditionally, I think the industry has engaged with patients who have tended to be very well informed, very, very engaged in their treatment, but perhaps not the norm. It's easier now to reach down through social media and through the tools that we've got available. Some of the advocacy groups are expanding their perspectives in this area to start to access patients who might be less engaged, might have a different experience, but could well be more representative of what the standard patient looks like out there. And lastly, the research. I think research has evolved to a point where we're really starting to be able to understand aspects like what is actually said in the conversation between the healthcare professional and the patient, and perhaps more importantly, what's not said, so that we see what's really going on in very important parts of the patient journey, and we no longer have to rely on people's recollection of what was said, or perhaps what people think they're saying relative to what they're actually saying. There are numerous techniques for this. Again, I'm not an expert and I won't delve into this in detail, but thinking about creative research that at key points in the journey can actually really help us to understand what's going on for different patient groups. So lastly, ensuring that insight drives action. And again, I think we've all been involved in processes to develop the patient journey that have been time-consuming, taken a lot of effort, sucked in a lot of resource, and at the end of that, our organisations have pretty much done what they were going to do before, give or take the odd patient leaflet. And it's really frustrating. I've certainly been in that situation. And in doing that, you're kind of the elephant that gives birth to the mouse. And I actually had this in a drug that I used to work on. One of my people spent about a year putting together a really, really well-thought-through web-based platform for patient support. And we rolled it out, and everybody was very pleased with it across Europe. The problem was that because the organisation didn't have a clear guidance on how to use a multi-country platform and how to put that into action, everybody wanted to rebuild the platform for themselves. They didn't have the resource, and so people didn't do it. And it just didn't work. It was so frustrating. So we've all been this elephant that gives birth to the mouse, I think. And that's something we've got to avoid. Now, the reason it doesn't happen in these settings is, I think, twofold. The first is about embedding the journey across the organisation. And one thing I think that we in this room kind of underestimate is the extent to which we're evangelists, and we need to take the rest of the organisation on a journey with us somewhat. And this is particularly important as you move away from advocacy, the commercial function, and perhaps medical, who are generally, and I speak generally, tend to be quite connected to the patient and customer need, and move back into really important parts of the organisation, the development part of the organisation, access, manufacturing even, who can play a really important role in enhancing patient experience, but are not traditionally being that close to the customer. So there's a real job to do here in terms of embedding the philosophy of why the patient journey matters and getting everybody to understand what it can yield in terms of insight before you can get to actually getting people to take on board the insights and turn that into behaviour. And it's something that there are a couple of colleagues in the room from GSK with me today, and it's something that in oncology we've been really focused on over the past 18 months, to the point that we've gone back to develop a common language around what are we talking about when we talk about the patient journey. What do we mean? What's a definition of good patient experience? How are we thinking about this across our organisation? And that's been a long process and quite a labour-intensive process, but it's meant that as we've rolled out the patient journey for melanoma and the insights that we've had and talked about what we're trying to do. We've had countries like Canada who've really taken that and run with it and been able to put in place support programs and experience programs which have made a real difference to patients. And you have to have that foundation, I think, if you're going to get people to actually do something with the information that you produce. The last thing is about being realistic. I told you that story about the drug that I worked on in kidney cancer, where we had that platform. It's very tempting to produce a comprehensive, multi-platform approach to trying to enhance patient experience. But if your front-end resource, in terms of the product managers in the country, have other priorities or so many priorities that they're just swamped, or if the organisation does not have the technical capacity, particularly in the digital field, to put these things into practice, then it's something that often can fall on deaf ears. It's better to produce something that people can use than something that is really, really great but never actually reaches the end user. And there's a piece there with our internal customers, and something that's right-sized for them is really important. What I would say, though, as a rejoinder to that, is we have to be ambitious, because you really have to stretch the boundaries and ask people to think differently, especially the way things are changing in the environment at the moment. So I think the idea is to be a little bit like this cat. You know the size of the box that you're trying to fit into, but you've got to push and try and go beyond a little bit. So, I've reached the end of my allotted time, and thank you for your attention. So I'll leave you with three thoughts. The first is the emotional perspective. Think about that overlay of emotion on the functional journey. Think about ways you can get that better. There are more tools to do it than ever before. Gives you a completely different perspective. Secondly, one size does not fit all. And lastly, don't be the elephant that gives birth to the mouse. Thank you.